Oh, well, welcome everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to be with us. Today we are joined by IDEA President, Dr. Ken Ryalls, and IDEA Senior Research Officer, Dr. Steve Benton, to discuss the common myths and misconceptions of student ratings and to take a deeper look on gender bias and bias overall. We polled registrants prior to the webinar to see if there were any burning questions to add to the mix. And we welcome everyone to write in questions in the chat room during the webinar as well, as you will be muted throughout the presentation. As we have time at the end, we'll get to them. We also plan to answer outstanding questions in an upcoming blog post. So let's get started. While most educators acknowledge the value and importance of creating opportunity for student feedback, there are a few that hold a strong belief that the student should not play a role in rating effectiveness at all. So let's start by providing a simple distinction. What is the difference between the terms student evaluation of teaching, or SET, and student ratings of instruction, SRI? And why is making that distinction important?
Well, I think it's important to make the distinction because too often we think about this whole process as an event rather than a process, and it really is developmental. And so we need to distinguish between the data that students provide, their perceptions of what occurred in the classroom, and evaluation, which is judgment of worth. And the people that are prepared and capable of making those judgments are the administrators and the faculty, but the students provide us with helpful input.
Great.
Yeah, so we believe strongly that students at IDEA, we believe that students can provide feedback that can help faculty in their teaching. So the feedback, not evaluation idea is a theme you're going to hear throughout the webinar. So ultimately, it's not a debate about whether some of the data can be erroneous or biased or messy, because certainly it can. It's ultimately a discussion about, number one, can students provide data to us that can help us in our teaching and therefore learning outcomes? And number two, how to use those data, even though they're messy.
Great, thank you. So as we dive into myths and misconceptions, we take a look at it at its truest meaning. So misconceptions are pieces of incorrect information. So myths and misconceptions exist around student ratings of instruction. So let's take a little bit of time to address a few of those. First, are students competent enough to rate teaching?
So this is a pretty common one, that students don't know what they're talking about. And you know, again, we find, first of all, students observe teaching more than anybody else. So for that reason alone, it makes sense to at least consider what they have to say about what goes on in the classroom. The better the questions that you ask, and the more competent the students are to answer those questions that you ask, the more likely you're going to be successful in gathering some information that matters. So, you know, there's a lot of validity studies out there about that students are very good at determining what goes on in the classroom for some things. And the one that sticks out to me the most is that the student correlation with faculty observance of what the achievements were in the classroom are very high. So therefore, what we draw from that is that students are actually just as good as faculty at determining what's going on in the classroom in terms of whether or not you've achieved in the classroom some of the learning outcomes you were going for. So they do have things to say, and they can be valuable feedback.
Thank you, thank you. And another one, students just want easy courses, and easy courses are rated higher than difficult ones. Is that a true statement?
Well, this idea has been around since ratings were first developed, and it rears its head from time to time. And actually, it's just the opposite of that. Our research has shown consistently across the years that students tend to give higher ratings to instructors they believe have high achievement standards. If you think about it, if a student's spending a lot of money and going into debt for their education, would they really want to have a class that really doesn't offer them anything? And what the evidence has also indicated for years is that the relationship between course difficulty in terms of the students' perceptions and how they rate the course is curvilinear. So ratings tend to be lower when the students perceive the class as either too easy or too difficult. And so moderate difficulty would be a better place to be. In other words, making the material clear enough for students to understand.
Great, thank you. And the notion that people tend to act, meaning filling out a survey only when they're angry. Is that true?
So this is actually a good example of anecdotal or N equals 1 information going up against the body of literature. So we all have had experiences in a classroom where we get angry feedback. But it really goes back to what Steve was just saying. It just makes sense that students who are not doing the work or not coming to class are not going to take the time, generally speaking, to log in and do an end of course rating system. They're just, I mean, if they were lazy during the semester, they're lazy at the end of the semester as well. So the opposite is really true, that most of the time, students who earn a low grade or no grade in a course are less likely than others to respond to surveys. What happens is a psychological phenomenon that when they are angry and they do respond, we tend to remember those much better, because that's the way the human brain is wired. We remember negative things a lot more saliently than we remember positive. So the feeling is that, boy, I get a lot of angry ratings, but the reality is that 90 to 95% of your ratings are going to be from students who are trying to provide positive feedback.
Thank you for that. And grade expectations. How about faculty grading of students' work? How does that affect student ratings, and does it?
Again, this is a topic that has been received a lot of study across the decades. The most comprehensive study was done by Centra in 2003, in which he looked at ratings in over 50,000 classes across multiple disciplines, multiple institutions, and found only a weak positive relationship between student ratings and grades. But this is not necessarily a bad thing. We would expect that students who learn more would get higher grades, but would also assign higher ratings because they learn more and it was a good experience. It could be that they are also that students that are more motivated earn higher ratings or give higher ratings and get better grades. So it's not necessarily a bad sign that there is a weak relationship.
Another explanation.
Well, Steve kind of touched on it a little bit, but you know, the positive evaluations go out with students who learn more. We've done our own research around IDEA, and it's encompassed, you know, over 500,000 classes at 300 institutions. And it shows that high ratings are more likely when their students say their teacher challenged them and had high achievement standards, which is kind of supportive of what Steve was just saying, that, you know, the more you feel you've learned, the more you're going to rate your learning outcomes as higher, and the more you're going to rate your instructor as better or more effective. And so yes, there's actually a relationship between faculty grades and student work, but it's not super strong. It's not as strong as you would think. So in other words, in English, what people are concerned about here is if you give high grades, you're buying a good rating or you're buying a good evaluation, and that doesn't work. It's, as we said in the last question, it's really hard to do that. And in fact, students, most of these things are done before students get grades anyway. That's the most effective way to do it. So, you know, it's hard to reward a professor for a good grade when you don't know what your grade is yet.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks for clearing up some of those misconceptions. And it leads us to the bulk of our topic today. One of the biggest concerns out there is, are student ratings useless because of gender bias or bias in general? So let's take a look. Over the past few years, headlines have proclaimed that students praise male professors, students give professors better evaluations if they think they're male, and bias against female instructors. Those are some titles of articles that have run in the last couple of years. We know that there's bias in student feedback because course ratings are surveys designed by humans, filled out by humans, but there's absolutely no way to turn off cognitive preconceptions, stereotypes, and expectations. And everything that we experience is processed through those filters. But that said, have there been any quality studies done around student ratings where gender bias has been found to be meaningful?
So this and racial bias is the $1 million question. And, you know, I spent a lot of time on the road with either clients or with at conferences, and I get this question, especially lately, more than anything else. So I'd like to emphasize a couple of things that you said, Carolyn, because I think they're really important. First of all, they do have bias. I mean, everything has bias because we're human beings and we carry around biases. So there's no way to get around that. So I'll go back to what I emphasized at the beginning, which is what you're looking for is how to use messy data, how to use data that has potential bias, rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying if there's bias, then we can't use it. Because if there's bias, and that's your standard, that if there's bias, we can't use it, we virtually can't use anything because we're all full of bias. So that's one thing I'd like to emphasize. The other thing I'd like to emphasize is when we talk about evidence of gender bias, we're talking about either studies that are meta-analyses of the data out there, or studies that are internal that have to do with the idea of student ratings of instruction system. So when we talk about gender bias, and we'll say things like there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence of it, you have to remember that we're talking about our particular world and the world of student ratings. We are not at all suggesting that there's no gender bias out there. So with that said, we're not finding a lot of evidence of gender bias in our student ratings of instruction. We did the study a few years ago and found that in terms of our student ratings of instruction instrument, there's no difference between male and females in filling out the form and in actually getting better grades. What is interesting is that because of all the uproar around gender bias in the last couple of months, or probably 6 months to a year, we actually did the study again and just ran it with 80,000 faculty members, and again found the same thing, that within our tool, there's no evidence of gender bias. If anything, it tends to trend towards females getting better evaluations than males. Again, that doesn't mean that there's no bias out there, just we're not finding it. It's a quite interesting phenomenon. Trust us, we're a nonprofit dedicated to learning and improving teaching in higher education. If we would love to find some evidence of that, because we'd be the first to publish it and say, look what we're doing to correct that. And we're not finding it.
And Dr. Benton, if you'd like to add a little bit more on other studies out there besides Idea Zone work, we'd be interested to hear some.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that as academics, we know we need to look very carefully at what's reported in the press about different things. And I would urge everyone to read the actual primary sources that are referred to in the popular press and render your own judgments. But I would say that the most comprehensive study was done by Centra and Gobbets. And again, they looked at tens of thousands of classes across multiple institutions, multiple disciplines. And they did not find any meaningful differences. They were able to look at possible student gender by faculty gender interactions. What they did find was a very slight tendency for female students to assign higher ratings to female instructors, but it was not substantial enough to affect teaching evaluations.
You know, and we'll just go back real quickly to the previous question or what was said before. We're not saying that gender bias doesn't exist. Let's talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I think, you know, I made the point before, but I think Steve just said something about you really have to start to read these things, these studies themselves. So, you know, it's a hot topic in the popular media, and it draws attention, and it draws attention to a subject that is really, really important. I mean, as I said, we'd love to find some evidence of gender bias because we'd love to be able to correct for it in our reporting. We're just not finding it. But some studies do. And that's the way science works. You get studies that do, you get studies that don't, and then you have to make a conclusion based upon the quality of some of those studies. Recently, there have been several studies that we've actually done some analyses on and some editorial notes on, which can be found on our website, that we're not very impressed with scientifically. So if you read the study and you see that there's gender bias or other biases going on, but then you do an analysis of the actual quality of the science, it's not very high. And it doesn't mean that we're motivated to shoot down anything that questions whether or not there's gender bias. It's just good science that we have to look at it and say, well, there's a lot of other explanations that can explain what happened. Here's some of the problems. And as I said, there's some editorial notes that we've written out there that kind of highlight some of those problems. So we're speaking in very overall terms. It does not mean that there's not studies out there that show bias, because there are. So, but overall, we're reaching the conclusion, even outside of our own SRI, that there's not a huge tendency for gender bias.
And I'd like to dovetail that into an overall bias question, knowing that we'll come back to gender bias or bias just in general, and how faculty can work if they do suspect there is a bias occurring within their classroom. But as a follow-up, there are very few quality studies that have been conducted on racial or ethnic bias specifically. But if suspected, what can we do from a ratings perspective to take a look at that?
Well, I'd like to begin by saying that, you know, we have to recognize that all measures are flawed. Not only, you know, there's been plenty of information out there about possible biases in student ratings. But when you think about the different ways that we collect evidence about teaching effectiveness, peer observers have their biases, administrators have their biases, instructor self-ratings are not completely objective, promotion and tenure committees possibly have their biases. So all measures of effectiveness are flawed, and this is a good reminder why we need multiple indicators of teaching effectiveness that should always be used. And especially if racial or ethnic bias is suspected, or gender bias, that becomes even more important to have multiple indicators. That way you get multiple perspectives and you decrease the likelihood that bias from one measure is going to cause one to make an incorrect judgment.
Right. You know, so again, following up, if the potential for bias is there, what can be done to counteract the potential effect on ratings?
So this is really interesting, and again goes back to the point around science is cumulative, and it does not, however, mean that your college cannot suffer from bias for a variety of reasons. And this could be any bias. It could be racial bias, it could be gender bias, sexual orientation, political bias. I mean, we see all of this in the popular press right now. So it could be that you indeed do have bias. And I think I saw a comment in some of the group chat that somebody mentioned this, that you need to rule out the fact that there are single situations that have bias in them, and that's absolutely and positively true. So overall, we're not seeing huge patterns of bias. It doesn't mean that you don't live in a hostile workplace and that you need to take care of your bias. So it's important to know that you can take care of bias because of what Steve was just saying. There's other things that you can look at. You can also make your own adjustments for bias. So we, in our system, we give you a lot of scores back, and we do not adjust for bias because we're not finding it. We do not adjust for racial bias because we don't track race currently anyway. But you can still, if you're doing an analysis and you're finding that there's pretty significant differences, then you can adjust for that as well. It's important to note, and this is where it gets really dangerous to suggest this. It's important to note that differences in scores do not necessarily mean bias. It could be the differences in scores are suggesting an actual true variance in performance or in suggested learning outcomes or whatever it is. And that makes sense from a perspective. So when you look at your data, you have to determine, is this a consistent bias against a gender or against a political affiliation or whatever it is? Or is this just an indication that this particular department does not teach that well and could use some help and some growth opportunities around teaching and learning? So that's what we have to be careful of as well when we're looking at it, is sometimes differences in scores are actually accurate.
Sure. And Dr. Benton, can you add a little more to that about how to reduce that impact over time?
Well, I think if our participants today remember nothing more than this, it would be never make an important decision about a faculty member based on a single score or a single source of evidence. And if we avoid doing that, if we include multiple scores, multiple ratings across time for an individual faculty member, multiple indicators of teaching effectiveness, documents from the class, student products, peer evaluations, administrator ratings, faculty self-reflections, the faculty members' efforts at improvement, external recognition. Right. If we look at all of those different sources, then it's unlikely that bias from a single source is going to lead us to make the wrong judgment. It's less likely.
Right.
Yeah, we'll see. Carolyn, if I could jump in a second. Sure. I mean, we see this all the time, is that when people are averse to student ratings, almost every faculty member I talk to says, I actually do care about what the students think and think I can get good evidence, but it's not used effectively, around that. It's not for development, it's used against me. And so a lot of times it's the process that we're talking about, not the actual tool that we're talking about. Right. And again, everybody recognizes in the end that these data are messy and that they can be biased, and as can all human data. But how do we use it effectively is the question.
Is the question. So again, I'll just wrap up this part, and we did take some questions from the audience early on, but the question is not, is there bias in this tool, but can we find usefulness in the data in spite of the bias inherent in humans? And we answered that to a pretty large extent over the last few minutes that we've been talking, but I'd like both of you to take a little bit of time to discuss that or give maybe some final opinions before we look at some audience questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth re-emphasizing over and over again. So yeah, we did touch on it a little bit, but every time I get the opportunity to speak about student ratings, I emphasize one 3-word phrase, and that is student voice matters. They've got something to say, and they should be listened to. And so I talk about that a lot when I speak about this issue in higher education. So their voice matters whether or not they're biased, because whenever I talk about this stuff, it's like, you know, everybody's biased. So what information can you glean from students? And what we do at IDEA, and of course all of you don't use IDEA, but what we do at IDEA is we ask about teaching and learning primarily and not personal characteristics. So we're not asking about gender-loaded or stereotypical characteristics such as, is this person kind, or does this person show caring towards me? Or we ask about observed teaching methods and perceived learning outcomes and the achievement of those learning outcomes. That means that it's less likely to be biased, even if the instructor, or even if the student is biased against a particular gender or orientation or race or whatever. It's hard to be biased about a question that doesn't have a lot of stereotypical loadings on it. So we try to get the teacher valuable feedback on how to get better by asking the right questions. And I would encourage you, if you don't use IDEA, to do the same thing. Think about the questions you're asking, whether or not the student is qualified to answer those questions, and then listen to what the students collectively have to say.
Right. And Dr. Benton, if you'd like to add a little to that.
Well, I think I'll just add by drawing upon an analogy in the health professions. If you read about ratings of physicians in that field, which we have, we find the same kind of complaints among physicians. Now, why should we care what patients have to say about our performance? They don't know anything about the medical field. And hospital administrators, however, are very concerned about what patients' perceptions are of their experiences. I suppose it's quite likely that some patients have gender and ethnic biases. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, if I were a hospital administrator who completely ignored the patient's perceptions, I'd be missing out on some valuable information to make decisions. On the other hand, if I use the patient's perceptions as the only measure of my physician's effectiveness, you'd consider me a fool.
Right. Good point. Good analogy. As I mentioned before, we had some questions that were posed over the course of this past week, and then we'll get to some that are popping up right now within the chat. We're going to take a little time to address those before moving on to the audience questions. And some of them are very intriguing as we read through them earlier this week that have led us to providing maybe some good evaluation on our own part. So the first one is, how does IDEA's student ratings of effectiveness, or SRI, account for bias towards faculty of color, and more specifically, female faculty of color? Does IDEA disaggregate data, particularly from institutions that are predominantly single race, that might shine a light on patterns of implicit or overt bias towards a faculty of color?
So a great question. And the fact is that we at IDEA do not track race. We track gender somewhat, in that we have names of faculty members, and so from that we can do an analysis of the likelihood of whether or not it's a male or female name, and we can select males versus females based. However, this is really interesting. At IDEA, we always consider ourselves partners with the client. And we always paint ourselves in that way, and we really live it in that way. And so if you have a situation on your campus where you're convinced that there's multiple things, so there's bias in the students, there might be bias in the administration, there might be misuse of the actual data by either the faculty or the administration, meaning that the process itself is broken, we're happy to consult with you on how to deal with those things. If you're willing to actually do a study for us on racial bias at either your institution or multiple institutions, we'd be happy to work with you on that. So clearly there are ways to get at those data, but we would need a partner at one of our institutions to get at those data. They would identify how people identify in terms of racial identification, and then we could do analyses of the results based on that. And the more the more institutions we could get to participate, the more valid that study would be. We actually do support research around IDEA and actually things outside of IDEA once in a while as well through some impact grants that we give. So if anybody would like to work with this on us, information on grants is on our website, and you could actually submit a study idea, and we might be able to work together to get some more information on racial bias.
Some good opportunities there. Another question came through, and it's a multi-part question. So if we begin by assuming that gender bias might exist in a face-to-face class, do we see the same in online classes? And then the second part, what teaching strategies can a female instructor in this instance use in the classroom to help counteract this tendency? Again, assuming there is one.
Well, one of the things I should probably say at the outset is that we've looked at differences in face-to-face and online classes overall in terms of ratings as a reminder that we find no meaningful differences between ratings in face-to-face and online classes. We have that in Technical Report 15 on our website if you'd like to take a look at it. But I think it's an interesting question as to whether or not we might find gender bias in one course format over another. We could certainly look at that, although my expectation is that we haven't found it thus far. We probably wouldn't find it, but it's something that we've talked about since this question came in, and we're going to take an approach to that as best we can. One of the things about IDEA that I just love is that we do our best to control for factors that influence ratings that we think shouldn't, and we control for those in our adjusted scores. We also provide comparative scores for the discipline. So we're doing the best we can to look at the variables that really do matter. And we'll continue to look at gender. And if we find something, then we'll be the first to report that we do.
Right. Excellent. Thank you. Another question that came in was, what are some ways that campuses could use data analysis or data visualization to help debunk some of the myths, not just related to bias, but all of the other myths we were talking about?
Well, I would encourage campuses to purchase an aggregate database of all of the classes on their campus. And it comes in a spreadsheet. The variables are easy to understand, compatible, because it is a spreadsheet, is compatible with R or SPSS or SAS. And if you have people on campus who could run your own analyses, and you could decide, okay, we're going to use the faculty information form or the objective selection form we're going to add another question. Let's say we could add another question to look at, have the students indicate their own gender as an extra question and just look if there's differences there. And see, knowing the gender of your faculty on your campus, you could certainly identify that. You could do your own analyses to look for possible gender of the instructor by gender of the student interaction. So, and if you need any help understanding the aggregate database or any suggestions about how you might conduct such an analysis, we'd be more than happy to consult with you.
Right. I think that's, before I open it up to audience questions, I think that that's an important piece to go back to is the ability of IDEA staff and the knowledge base that we have to work with the institutions on those specific issues. So I'm glad that you brought that up as well, Dr. Benton. So we do have a few questions that have come in from the group, and I'm going to turn my head a little to the right to take a look at some of them and see if we can't get those answered. We did have a question that came in looking at large sample sizes, or what about large sample sizes? And I just lost it because people are asking questions quickly. I see. There we go. What about large sample sizes making it more difficult to find significant differences?
Well, actually, it's just the opposite. Large sample sizes make it easier to find significant differences.
Okay.
And rather than focusing on statistically significant differences, we want to talk about meaningful differences.
Okay.
And if you look at the studies that have been done on gender, for example, they don't explain any more than 1% of the variance in the ratings. And so that's really the important factor to look at, not whether it's statistically significant, but is it meaningful difference? If we're talking about a difference of, 0.10 in ratings, is that meaningful? Not really.
Right.
Yeah, and I think Angela actually makes that point. Angela Lentz from Penn State actually makes that point later in there that says it's a good idea not to concentrate too much on small differences, and that's one of the things that Steve and I are saying that are hopefully coming through loud and clear. That this is a big picture kind of thing. The best way to use messy data and biased data and human data is to not look at any one score in isolation or any one class in isolation, and instead look over time and see patterns emerging over time. And if you have a culture of improvement and development versus a culture of a punitive culture of evaluation and punishment, it's a much more healthier environment to work in. And it makes it much easier to say, yeah, I got a bad rating in that class, or that particular rating was bad, but I know for a fact nobody's going to pick that out and hold it against me and make me feel bad about it. So I absolutely agree with Angela when she says, don't look at any one score and these minimal differences between any one score. You're looking over time for patterns of improvement and patterns of engagement. As Steve said, you look for patterns of a lot of things. Student ratings are just one part of those patterns. But as a former dean, I'd much rather see a faculty member engaged and trying new things than I would, getting a 4.2 on a scale. It's an easy call for me. Now, I know that's not the case at other institutions, but for me, it's simple. So multiple sources of information are great.
Okay. Agreed. We're going to backtrack a little bit. There's a question that came in that asked how IDEA analyzed our data that support that there is not evidence that females do worse on our study that we did with gender bias.
Well, as an IDEA user,
They did better.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Sorry.
As an IDEA user, you all know that you're not asked to indicate your gender. So we use a procedure in R that identifies, using the first name of the faculty member, identifies within a leveled probability the gender of that faculty member. And it also throws out any that are uncertain, and this is based on English first names. And so we got down to a sample that included about 15,000 female instructors and 13,000 male instructors. And we looked at simple means and standard deviations for those two groups. Interestingly, the progress on relevant objectives, or the average progress on relevant objectives, the average overall rating of excellence of the instructor, and the average overall excellence of the course were absolutely nearly the identical value.
Okay. Well,
So Steve, I wonder if you can throw some things in here around, the differences in the scales as well. That again, emphasizing that it's not super important. What is the tightness of that scale? And when they're almost identical, statistically, they are identical. Well, with a big N like that, it's probably statistically significant differences, but not meaningful in any way.
Yeah, you're talking about a difference of 4.14 versus 4.16, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so it's
pretty limited. We had another question that came up that asked about, when bias is suspected, to gather the data from the multiple sources, which is what we've said, and don't ask about personal characteristics. But what else? Because some of those suggestions that we offer aren't necessarily available to faculty.
Yeah, so I think that those are important, but I think the most important thing are the two things we keep emphasizing. One is multiple sources of information. Ironically, when you pick often when we do peer review, those peers are picked by us to come into our class and look at the class and see how we're doing, which is rife with bias. And nobody ever says anything about that. Administrators are biased because they're human beings, but the more of those data points that you can get, the more likely you are to get a good picture of performance. So you macro level the analysis. That's a great way to do it. And you also look over time to make sure that you're getting a picture over time. So, the last thing I would say is if you've analyzed the data and if you see differences in scores that seem to be systemic towards a particular bias, without knowing any other information about the situation, we would not see a problem with adjusting those scores. So if men happen to get 0.5 lower than women and it doesn't seem to be playing out in terms of peer reviews or administrative reviews, so it seems to be some sort of bias coming from the students, you can certainly adjust privately. There's nothing wrong with that to try and get the best picture possible. But as I said before, it's hard to know if those differences are truly differences in performance or if they're due to bias. That's why you have to look at the other data involved.
Right. And as we took a look and made some of the comments on the recent studies, this just came up in chat as well. Somebody was asking where they could find some of the commentary. We have two places where you can find that commentary. One is in our blog posts and one is in our editorial pages on our website. We'll make sure to include those links as well as we do a recap of this webinar. So we're going to take a look just at a few more questions before we wrap things up a little bit. Let's talk about that paper a little bit. When somebody asked a question about it, the most recent study that was done, that was published in Inside Higher Education and on npr.edu.org online, it took a look at a study in our paper as we did the dissection, took a look at the flaws within the study. Can you talk just a little bit about that, Dr. Benton?
Well, you've kind of caught me off guard here.
Or you can read it online.
If you want to go to another question, I'll go back and look at the comments.
That's okay. That's right.
Articles.
Well, I think I could speak to it, Carolyn,
Sure.
in general terms. It's a very fine line for us at IDEA to actually issue a critique. But, sometimes wildfires occur in the media and we feel like we have to start to try to have a scientific voice in the midst of papers that start out with everybody knows that, it's like, well, that's actually not true, but
right.
Okay. So, we spend a lot of time thinking about whether or not to quote, critique or attack a current study because we don't want to look vindictive or petty. What we're trying to do with these studies or these critiques is point out the fact that you really need to dig deeper into some of the other things that we're working on. And we're just amazed by some of the outright falsehoods that are presented in some of these studies and the way the media tend to ignore those and kind of go off on their own tangent. I've seen many studies these days or many articles in the past couple of months that say, this is a growing body of evidence against the student evaluation and they're full of bias and they hate women and they hate people of color. And it's just not true. It's just not playing out in the scientific literature. It might be playing out in a single study here and a single study there. So what we're trying to do with these is trying to get people turned around. But what we're really trying to do after these critiques is getting out some papers. So Steve and I are actually working on a paper around myths and misconceptions. And then we're actually getting out some papers around effective faculty evaluation systems and things like that, because our job is to help people get better. I think the worst thing that we could do is shut down student voice. I think it's just, it's, first of all, and this is not a great reason, but it's not going to sit well with parents and legislators and students who consider themselves consumers, for better or worse. Second of all, it's not the right thing to do. They have some things to say. It's as if your doctor wouldn't ask you, how did I do in terms of patient care? Because I really don't care what you think.
Right.
And most of us can relate to that without worrying about, what it means to my career. It's like, if a doctor is bad to me, I want to be able to give feedback on that.
Right.
And it's the same thing in the classroom. Students have something to say. And I think we just need to keep fighting that they have something to say and it's useful for us to get better.
Right.
Carolyn, I did find my comments about that article. I'll just quickly say a couple of things that are fairly common in the research on student ratings. One is we really don't know what was measured in the student ratings. We oftentimes you see that, well, an SET measure was used, and we know nothing about its validity and reliability. And in this particular study, that was true. And secondly, there was a learning outcome that we really were provided no evidence at all about what that learning outcome was, or whether it had any validity or reliability. And then the third thing I would say that we often find in these studies is that the correlations were very weak and didn't really lead to much more than 1% of the variance, yet it made headlines that there is, gender bias is rampant in student ratings.
Right.
And it's simply not the case.
Right. I thank you for taking the time to take a look at that. I wanted to bring that up simply because it had appeared in the chat room multiple times over the course of this webinar. But I'd like to offer both of you the opportunities for some final comments as we wrap things up, because as we said earlier, bias does exist. Myths and misconceptions do exist. So that all said, if you'd each like to take just a few minutes to wrap things up, make some final comments, and I think we'll be finished.
Well, I'll give Ken the last word since he is the president. And I would just say, to reiterate that just make sure that we use common sense in making these judgments, these evaluations about teaching effectiveness, and understand that their primary value is for improvement, which is why we exist as an organization, to improve teaching and learning in higher education. And to do that requires to do your due diligence, to look at multiple indicators of teaching effectiveness, and to allow faculty and administrators to render the evaluation, and to not think of this as an event, but rather as a process.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, so because Steve went first, all I can say is ditto. I think it's really important to remember that, as we've been emphasizing the whole time here, that student voice does matter, that we need to recognize that they can be a valuable source of information for us to get better. We need to divorce ourselves from the personal nature of that, and that's very, very difficult to do sometimes. Mm-hmm. I can still, as a former professor, I can still remember the most scathing comments that I got from faculty. Or from students. It just doesn't go away. We remember those things. Criticisms of hair or clothes or attitude or whatever, and they just stick with you. That's why it's really critically important to get a picture over time and to use that picture over time. I would also emphasize that we spend much of our time, faculty often see us as as a company that comes in and we're selling student ratings, and therefore we're kind of a shill for the administration. We spend much of our time, I would say almost half of our time, going the other direction, fighting, educating administrators on how best to use these data. Because often the process is in place, it's broken, and nobody's looking at the process, they're looking at the tool. The faculty are blaming the tool, the administrators are blaming the faculty, and it's that not the tool is broken, but it's not being used correctly. So we really have to we spend a lot of time just educating people on how best to use these data. And whether or not you use IDEA, we're available to do that. If you use IDEA as a client, we're definitely available to do that. And you should be calling us and telling us that you need our help. Because if the process is broken, it ain't gonna work. It's an old Jonathan Deming thing from management theory. You can't work in a broken process and expect good outcomes.
Right.
So focus on your process first, and then look at the tool and see if it's good. And if it's not, you should probably call IDEA.
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, we plan on addressing the questions that we didn't get to today, and we'll take a look through those. In an upcoming blog post, we also recorded this session, which will be available to everyone and any folks that couldn't join us today. As was just mentioned, we're happy to work with you in meeting the specific needs of your institutions, so don't hesitate to give us a call. And then a few other things. Consider registering for our next webinar on April 20th as we examine the newest learning objectives and teaching methods added to IDEA's student ratings of instruction. And then just finally, on behalf of Dr. Ryalls and Dr. Benton and the entire IDEA staff, I'd like to thank the audience for being here today, and have a great day.